Good morning, Ram Nation. We are back with another edition of DNVR Rams Live. I, of course, am Justin Michael. It's been a couple of days. It's been chaotic. I actually did record a two-part podcast last night that should be up in your feeds by now. I was having some issues uploading the second part, but part one definitely in the feed. It was fun. I talked about Isaiah Stevens, talked about Gian Clavel representing CSU men's basketball in the Olympics for Puerto Rico. I talked about a developing situation in Utah State. Very, very weird. Blake Anderson, seemingly out of nowhere, is being let go. There's all kinds of stuff about basically improper handling of sexual assault. So it's a very serious situation. But, the Rams now in position, even more so than before, to hopefully take advantage of a very advantageous Mountain West schedule. Non-conference slate is pretty tough, at least to begin, but they do have 3 straight home games at one point. You play 7 home games overall. Now more than half your schedule will be against first-year coaches. Now or never, so go back and check that out if you missed it. I also gave a recruiting update. Michael Dever has decommitted from CSU. He has since flipped to Texas Tech. Just gave kind of some thoughts on that, as well as some under the radar players that could very deceptively be some of the biggest keys to CSU's success this year. I've talked about this before, and so has Dre more than once, but it's not like top end talent or a lack of top end talent has been CSU's problem over the years. It's sometimes been the gaps in between. It's like they have this established talent and they have intriguing young talent, but the depth in between hasn't always been there. A little bit worried that's going to be the case for the Rams on the defensive side this year. We'll kind of have to see how all that plays out. Really going to need some veterans to step up and really carry this team if they are going to live up to what I think are very reasonable expectations from the fan base, which, at this point, I think it's bowl game or nothing. And really, it's probably bowl win at this point. You could throw in some other qualifiers for determining a successful season. For instance, a winning conference record, a winning record in rivalry games, something that hasn't happened since 2016. So there's a lot of things that we'll talk about as we get closer to this season. I'll be going out to media days this week in Las Vegas. Really excited for that opportunity to catch up with Torrey Horton and Jack Howell. We'll have fall camp in about a month, but it'll be great to see those guys in person. They're always really, really open and personable with me. Jay Norvell's been nothing but great to me from an interview standpoint since he's been in Fort Collins, so I'm looking forward to that. I'll keep you guys in the loop as far as what the content schedule is going to be later this week. It's been chaos, guys, between moving. I'm in Fort Collins. I'm not sure if you can tell, but I am in Fort Collins. Obviously don't have the entire office set up yet, but we're getting there, making progress. It's been hectic, had some vehicle troubles. Car died about 100 yards from the new property, so that was exciting. Never ends. Life, never ends, never stops throwing punches. When you think you've got your balance, boom, here comes that haymaker you don't see coming. I am excited, though, to get out to Vegas for media days to take a breath after the chaos of moving and all of that. I'm going to give some Mountain West storylines that I'm interested in at media days. Obviously, we're going to find out the all-conference picks. On today's show, I'm going to give out who I voted for the preseason all-conference picks. I haven't seen anybody else release it. There's not officially any rules against it, so hopefully this is not breaking some type of protocol. Sometimes I guess you got to ask for forgiveness. I don't know. I don't think it's that big of a deal. We'll find out in 2 days who the official all-conference selections are for the preseason all-Mountain West team. But I just thought I'd give you guys an idea of where my mindset was at going into this year, how I filled out my ballot and all that. It's not just as simple as writing in the candidates that you desire. There were a couple guys that I would have voted for on certain teams that actually were not even choices on the ballot. So that's something you have to keep in mind. Starting with the number one storyline I'm most interested in Mountain West Media Days this week, and then we'll get into who I picked for the preseason all-conference positions. What the hell is going to happen with Utah State at this point? It's a disastrous situation with Blake Anderson and everything that's happened there. They had already lost their 2 most veteran quarterbacks after the spring. now you're in a situation where as soon as that move becomes official, the portal opens up for your entire roster. I mean, Utah State on both sides of the ball between safety Ike Larson and wide receiver Jalen Royals, those are potential All-American candidates. I mean, those are guys that stuff the stat sheet, and I have to imagine there's already quite a few Power Four schools that are kind of lurking, circling their DMs and all that type of stuff. I already saw Ike Larson tweet a couple of cryptic things, so would not shock me if before the season starts he ends up elsewhere. That's just me guessing. I don't have any inside information or anything like that, but it just seems like a really weird spot. And I'm very curious to see how it plays out. I'm curious to see how the players respond at media days, how the interim coach responds getting thrust into this situation, like less than a week before media days, a month before fall camp is just insane. I will say, and I don't want to be tone deaf. I don't want to just look at this from the football implications, which are obviously massive. I mean, Utah State has been one of the more competitive and consistent programs these last couple of years under Blake Anderson. They've been highly explosive offensively, and they've had some real playmakers on the defensive side. They've done a good job of leaning on the transfer portal, really reloading year to year. It's been impressive, the consistency that they've had, but this was obviously a really, really big deal, something that was much more important than football or wins and losses or stats, and that's the improper handling of sexual assault. And I don't know what happens here. I know Blake Anderson's already lawyered up. I'm sure there's going to be more sides, I guess, of this that come out, but I do commend Utah State for handling a really challenging situation with appropriate action, which is not what a lot of schools would do. Just being real, like a lot of schools, especially if you're expected to compete, would do their best to sweep it under the rug. And I think administratively, some of that probably happened these last couple of years, and that's why like the deputy AD is also out. It sounds like they just had some bad apples in that cabinet, and it was a cabinet that needed to be cleaned out. So I respect Utah State for making the respectable, albeit challenging decision, because it can really derail your season. And we know that, but at some point a man's got to have a code. You got to stand up for what's right. And, obviously this is what needed to happen in Logan. The next storyline I'm interested in from a Mountain West standpoint nationally is, how does Boise State factor into the equation? I'll get into it, but I think they're going to get a lot of love in the preseason. I think there's a decent chance they end up with the preseason offensive and preseason defensive player of the year. I'd be shocked if they're not picked to win the league. Is Ashton Jeanty a legitimate Heisman candidate, though? I really do want to see how that plays out. I think they're certainly going to try. Funny enough, he's not 21, so I don't think he'll be able to be at media days. That happened with Torrey Horton last year. He will be out there this year for CSU. But, what kind of workload does GNT get? He's been their bell cow the last couple of years. I think he's legitimately in the conversation for running back one, especially with another tricky situation outside of football with Ollie Gordon and his DUI ordeal, which recently occurred. I mean, there's a chance that GNT, if he could have like a 2,000 yard rushing season, or if he could somehow, and maybe he increases his receiving numbers, which aren't bad. I mean, he's been really consistent as a receiver, but if he could go for like 1,500 on the ground and 700 through the air or something like that, I will be curious to see like what type of love and respect he gets, if he's a real Heisman candidate, and if he is ultimately able to kind of lead them to the college football playoff, which I think is probably going to be their goal. On the Toyota chat, we've got a question from Kerry Reynolds. Who do you think is going to be quarterback one at Boise State? I think it's going to be Malachi Nelson, who obviously transferred in from USC. I will say, based on everything I've heard from Boise supporters, people that follow the program closer than I do, Maddox Madsen is very popular with the OC and the staff. I have a hard time seeing them bring over a 5-star, a guy with as much athletic potential, and not roll with him, especially because he had nice moments. But I mean, like, we kind of know who Madsen is at this point. I still don't understand the decision to go away from Taylon Green, if I'm being completely honest. I think it's ultimately what costs Andy Avalos his job. But I'm really interested to see kind of what happens there in Boise. Next storyline I'm interested in, this is more general. Which quarterback that's already established, and this would not really apply to Boise State if Malachi Nelson is their starter, but who out of the established quarterbacks can make the biggest leap? I think there were really three choices logically that made the most sense for preseason all conference pick at quarterback. And I think just about every national outlet I've looked at so far has had a different one. I'll obviously get into who I voted for here in just a couple minutes. But to me, it comes down to Braden Fowler-Nicolosi at CSU, Braden Schrager at Hawaii, and Mikey Keene of Fresno State. Statistically speaking, those guys put up the biggest numbers, or the most consistent producers as far as returning talent goes. All those guys have a ton of arm talent. All those guys are going to be in position to throw the football a whole lot. Who can make that leap? If I had to say who I think has the most physical abilities, I think it's probably BFN. I think it's Fowler-Nicolosi. I think Mikey Keene played the position the most precise a year ago, did a better job of limiting turnovers. But who out of those guys can make a leap? Because there's an opportunity if you're Fresno to push for a Mountain West championship, just especially with so much chaos throughout the league and a lack of continuity within the other rosters and staffs. You would expect Fresno State with Tedford back, with the established quarterback, as being a team that should be up there pushing with Boise State. I think you're going to see teams like Air Force. I'm going to get all of that, get into all of that. But who out of those established quarterbacks can make the biggest leap? We got some more questions. Henry Randall wants to know any information on how summer practices went, how the new freshmen are looking. It's just kind of workouts at this point. So, not a ton at this point. I know they're excited about quite a few of the freshmen. That'll be more of what happens in a month. Right now, it's not really organized. It's just a lot of workouts. It's not like they're out there in pads and stuff. So not a ton as far as takeaways go. David Adams in the Toyota chat wants to know, what's going on with recruiting? Dever changed his mind. I haven't seen any new commits in a minute. Time to worry. No, it's not time to worry. Yeah, Dever decommitting, and I talked about this on a two-part podcast last night, was disappointing. A little bit confusing, too, because Texas Tech was his first offer. Commits to CSU on June 23rd over Texas Tech, then later flips it. I could just be as simple as a guy got cold feet about leaving home and wants to stay close. I could sit here and speculate a million different reasons why he may or may not have changed his mind, but ultimately it's just part of the process. The good thing is there have not been a ton of decommits for CSU. I believe off the top of my head, this is only the third in the last 3 years. So this staff does a good job of establishing relationships and maintaining them. And as far as the lack of recent news, don't worry about it. They've got a really intriguing wide receiver out of Alabama that recently verbally committed. He has not posted yet, so I don't want to get more into that. I like to let these guys have their moments and not steal their spotlight. But they have a receiver out of Alabama coming in. There's another huge offensive lineman out of California that committed behind the scenes. He has not posted yet. He's not very active on social. I'm actually going to reach out to him and see if maybe he'll come break that on the podcast. But I wouldn't panic. I think the guys that they have committed are in a really good spot. I think the talent that they're bringing in is intriguing. And more than anything, this staff just sticks to their principles. You're going to lose a guy every now and then, especially in 2024. You just don't want to, I guess, you don't want to be chicken little about it. You don't want to think the sky is falling when it's not necessarily. Some more storylines I'm interested in from the Mountain West side before I get into who I picked for my preseason all-conference team. Which perceived contender disappoints? Is that Boise State, who is probably the sexy national pick? Could it be Fresno State? Do they take a step back? They do bring Mikey Keene back, but you've lost a lot of talent at the skill positions the last couple of years. That could be a factor for them. Air Force, under Troy Calhoun, obviously they've lost a ton of guys on both sides of the ball, but I mean, their success these last 10 years, it automatically puts them in the conversation. A team like Wyoming, UNLV. UNLV is the fun pick with Barry Odom back, but they lose Maeva under center. Does Matthew Sluka hit the ground running, the Holy Cross transfer that they brought in from the FCS? I'm kind of interested to see what happens there. I'll be honest, I'm still in kind of wait and see mode with UNLV. I think there's a little bit of recency bias there. they were a great team. They were tough. They were well coached. What Barry Odom did last year, I thought he should have been the national coach of the year. That's how impressive of a turnaround it was in year one for him. But can you maintain it? That's all I want to see. I think there's a little bit of just recency bias. That's all I'm saying there. Can any of the first year coaches find immediate success? Some of these coaches are first year, but you're going to have some continuity, like a Wyoming. Defensively, they bring a ton of talent back. If you're Utah State, assuming that the entire team doesn't just hit the portal in the next couple of weeks, are they able to establish some success with their interim guy, knowing that you have guys like Jalen Royal at wide receiver, Ike Larson at safety? Can they find some success? I'm interested to see which of the first year programs is the best. If I had to put my money on it, it would be Wyoming, just because they've got a solid offensive line. They're going to be able to run the football with Harrison Whaley, and defensively, they're probably my favorite group on paper in the conference coming into the year. I'd be kind of surprised if Wyoming doesn't at least go 500. That said, with their schedule, I don't know if they're going to be in contention either. Interested to see what happens with the Pokes. I think the loss of Craig Bowl is just absolutely massive. Finally, the last storyline, and obviously this is more CSU centric, but can the Rams take advantage of a favorable conference schedule and finally turn the corner, man? Like, you got 7 home games, you got 7 first-year coaches, you return on paper some of the most explosive talent in the conference offensively. Jack Howell looking to become the first CSU defensive player, or any player ever, but first CSU defender to be a 3 straight all-conference selection. There's a lot to like about the Rams on paper for a variety of reasons. The talent that they have, the continuity that they have within their staff, and a schedule that is very favorable. Again, at least on paper, you still got to go out and play the games. And if you're a Ram fan that is skeptical because of how the last decade has been, I certainly can't look you in the eyes and tell you you're wrong, because this team has done less with more very consistently for a long time. And it's been frustrating, but all the cards are lined up. Everything is there for this team to make a big leap. And a big part of that is the talent that's returning. And, as Henry Randall says in the comment section, I'm going to get to this here in just a second. He says he's really high on BFN this year after getting thrown into the starting job and playing well. He has talent, and now that he has a full offseason, knowing he's got the job, it's got to be huge. Could not agree more. Henry. I think having an entire spring as QB1 was very underrated, but all of fall camp as well. It was such a challenging spot for a young QB to get really thrown into the fire last year. I mean, he had a little experience. People forget he actually won, or he was the starter when CSU won in Nevada in 2022 as well. So it's not like he'd never played. He did get some experience in that Sacramento State game as well. Actually, I think cracked a rib from a hit he took in that. The dude was tough as nails. Really excited for BFN. And speaking of which, he is my selection for preseason all conference. I picked him at quarterback. I do think it is a 3-man race between him, Schrager, and Mikey Keene, although you could throw some wild cards into the mix depending on what happens there. Like at UNLV, for instance, Utah State, I'm interested to see kind of what happens there. I'm going to keep talking about this, but I do want to tell you guys, you got to choose a chill mindset. And sometimes it's easier said than done. This past week has really tested me. I think I hate moving more than just about anything. It's up there with paying taxes for the most tedious and mind-numbing process. Had some car issues on top of that. It was just a situation where I very easily could have got overwhelmed, could have been a jerk, and instead took a deep breath, breathed in some of that sweet Fort Collins air, felt the grass between my toes. Then I cracked open an ice cold Coors Light, and life was good. It was important to make sure I was in the right mindset first. You don't just want to crack open a beer and think that's going to solve all your problems or anything like that. But when life gets chaotic, take a minute, take some deep breaths, put yourself in that chill mindset, and then crack open a silver bullet. When those mountains turn blue, it's as cold as the Rockies, cold lagered, cold filtered, and cold packaged for a smoother finish. Make the most out of the times you choose to chill. Get Coors Light delivered straight to your door with Instacart by going to CoorsLight.com/DNVR. Celebrate responsibly. Coors Brewing Company, Golden, Colorado. I also want to shout out Game Time. Buying last-minute tickets has never been easier with the homies over at Game Time. they've got a little bit of everything. I mean, if you're looking for stand-up comedy, maybe you're trying to hit a show at Comedy Works, maybe you want to catch a Rockies game. Rockies do have some young, intriguing talent. I know they're a train wreck. I know they're terrible. I know the ownership is a joke and all that, but they do have some fun young guys that are worth hitting the ballpark for, taking it in. Obviously, it's the best spot to have an outdoor beer in the city, at least in my opinion. What's awesome about Game Time is you don't have to plan weeks ahead. Actually, they incentivize you to not have to. You can save up to 60% buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater. They've got flash deals, they've got zone deals, all in pricing, the lowest price guarantee. Shop with Game Time, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the app, create an account, use that code DNVR for $20 off your first purchase. Terms to apply again. Create an account, use that code DNVR for $20 off. Download Game Time today, last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. My homie Taylor in the Toyota chat says football season is so close, I can taste it. Me too, man. It's right there on the tip of the tongue. All right, let's get into some of these all conference picks, the contenders and pretenders, all of the interesting stuff that we look for. I just spilled water on my magazine here, which is never fun. All right. I'm going to give out my votes again. This is not the official preseason All Mountain West team. We'll find that out in a couple of days. I'll talk about that. I'll write about that. We'll talk about the snubs, who made the team, but maybe shouldn't have, all that fun stuff. I don't really like going negative in those instances, but we'll see. My pick to win the league, though, was Boise State. I voted, you rank them in order how you think it's going to be, 1 through 12. Boise State, I had 1. I believe I had Nevada 12th, New Mexico 11th. I did have CSU 3rd, which is much higher than I anticipated putting them. A lot of that has to do with how favorable their conference schedule is compared to some of those other top teams. I think Air Force and CSU kind of lucked out. UNLV, Fresno, Boise all have kind of tough schedules within the league. So I'm interested to see out of those West Coast teams, especially who is kind of able to just establish the most consistency or play the best, the most consistently, I guess would be the easier way to say it. Sometimes I get a little too cute. Some of the contenders, I think, outside of Boise State, Fresno State, obviously, UNLV, if they can do it. CSU, just with the schedule, the way it pushes, Wyoming and Air Force. The thing about Boise State, and I don't know if at receiver especially they have the talent that like a UNLV or CSU has. They've obviously got the best backfield in the league, although there are some other really, really talented running backs in the conference as well. But they probably have the preseason offensive and defensive player of the year. I did vote for Ashton Jeanty as the offensive player of the year. To me, you would go with him, you would go with Torrey Horton, or you would go with Ricky White of UNLV, and there really aren't any other realistic. I mean, maybe I guess you could throw like a Mikey Keene or a Braden Schrager out there. But I just think Jeanty, with the workload that he's going to get, with the spotlight that Boise State is going to have, he's the most logical pick. Defensive player of the year, I also went Boise State with Ahmed Hassanin, their star defensive end, returns as the conference's leader in sacks these past couple years. Now that Mo Camara is out of the picture, it's hard to come up with an argument of why you shouldn't vote for Boise if you think they have the preseason offensive and defensive player of the year. They have continuity within their offensive line. I mean, the big thing for them, and we already kind of talked about it, is what happens at QB. Can Malachi Nelson be the guy he was hyped up to be when he was a 5-star recruit? Obviously, all the arm talent is there, but we'll see. It's a really interesting spot because it doesn't feel like the typical 5-star guy who maybe left because he's an attitude case or something like that. I mean, he's behind one of the truly generational talents, one of the greatest college quarterbacks I've ever seen in Caleb Williams, at least from a raw tool standpoint. He very easily could be like the steal of the century for Boise State. He could also be another 5-star quarterback that just doesn't pan out and we never hear from again. But I am really interested to see. That said, I think Boise State is going to be the preseason pick. They return so much talent, and the top end talent especially is hard to argue with. Special teams player of the year, I went with Jacob DeJesus, wide receiver from the UNLV, punt returner and kick returner. I'd still take Torrey Horton over him, both at receiver, obviously, but even as a returner. UNLV in general, I get it. They were the fun, flashy team, and I'm not trying to take anything away from DeJesus or Ricky White, because both of those guys are studs at what they do. Said it before, though, still think there's some recency bias. I still think Torrey, if you're going pound for pound, I think he's the best return guy in the game. It's why I picked him as my preseason pick for punt returner. I did pick DeJesus as kick returner. I did vote for him as a special teams player of the year, but some of that has to do with I think he's going to get a higher volume of returns because Torrey is such a bigger factor for his team on offense. He's just going to be a lot more important. I don't know if he's necessarily going to be back there for every punt return, but he definitely is going to be a returner. I know that's kind of controversial amongst fans should you have star players out there, but I can just tell you that the mindset of this staff is one Torrey Horton return can break open the whole game. We've seen that. I mean, he's housed a punt each of the last 2 years. The counter is obviously, do you want him potentially taking extra hits, especially after just the beating he took last year? His toughness was so significant a year ago, and I think it's probably his most underrated quality. I mean, you see the speed, you see the pass catching, the route running, just the natural ability to get open and an understanding space. He plays the receiver position at such a high level. But for me, what stood out more than anything was just seeing him get up time after time after, I mean, he just got murked in the open field so many times this past year. Can't say enough about his toughness. All right, let's get into these all conference picks. So we do have a question, I guess, from Henry in the Toyota chat. With Millen going to Florida and Stratton going to Iowa, any top Mountain West quarterback, Maeva going to USC, who do you think were the teams reaching out to BFN? Not trying to throw off your talking points, but thoughts? No, but you're fine. Anything you guys want to hear, I will give you the best response that I have. Maybe not necessarily right away, but any questions you guys have, keep them firing in the Toyota chat. If you're watching on X, come over and watch on YouTube, where you can be an active participant in the Toyota chat. And if you wouldn't mind giving us thumbs up, I certainly would appreciate it. Helps with the algorithm and all that fun stuff. I've heard that Texas Tech had offered BFN. That makes a lot of sense to me, given his background. I think there were a couple of Texas schools that were interested. I don't have specifics as far as some of the other schools. Texas Tech is the one that I have heard. That's the one I feel the most confident in putting out there. But I don't want to just float schools willy-nilly, because I don't think that's necessarily fair either. I can tell you, though, there are a lot of schools that have been in the DMs of players in recent years. Ole Miss has been bad about it. Arkansas has been bad about it. Michigan has done a lot of tampering in recent years. Ole Miss, though, is probably the one quietly. They have gone after some CSU stars repeatedly. Florida as well. Wouldn't have shocked me if Justice Ross Simmons would have ended up at Florida. He obviously ended up at Syracuse, who encouraged him to jump in the portal in the first place. But I think if it weren't for some academic stuff, probably would have ended up at Florida. Anyways, getting into my preseason all-conference selections, I alluded to it before the break, but I did pick Braden Fowler-Nicolosi for a couple of reasons. One, I think arm talent, he's on par with anybody in the league, if not superior. I thought his ability to lead the offense when the lights are brightest, when the game was on the line, was very impressive. I mean, he had some moments, and obviously he needs to cut down the turnovers in particular. I don't think he played really very well in Laramie. I thought that was, the Wyoming game was probably his worst game of the season. I also think he was lights out against UNLV. I thought he was awesome down the stretch against Hawaii. He was money in Boulder. Against Middle Tennessee State, he made some really big throws, and obviously what he did against Boise State was next level. He's going to put up the numbers because, inherently the style of this offense is going to allow him to put up big numbers, and that is going to help your cause when it comes to all conference recognition. Stat-wise, it'll be interesting to see between him and Traeger, and obviously they run the run and shoot in Hawaii, another offense that stylistically is going to put up big numbers. Which one of those guys can come out on top? Both of them rip it. Both of them probably need to cut down the turnovers a little bit. But I am banking on BFN behind an offensive line that has continuity, with a receiver group that has as much talent as anybody in the league, with a running game that's intriguing. with Justin Marshall and a handful of talented backs. I am banking on BFN making that leap and really breaking out in year 2 as a starter. He said all the right things in spring. I thought he looked really good in spring as well. Big year. It's a huge year for him. I mean, if he can take this offense to the next level, it's probably the difference between CSU reaching its goals or not. But I am banking on that. I think he's going to get some love, assuming that everything happens that I believe will happen, for being a key factor in CSU kind of returning to contender status. I don't think they're going to win the league. I do think they're going to be in the mix, though, more so than a lot of cynics believe. And I'm not even saying that to be a jerk. Like, I think cynicism is warranted at this point with how little CSU has been able to live up to expectations in recent years, but it feels different. I've said that before. I know I have, but it does feel different this time. At running back, obviously Ashton Gianti. I mean, I've already raved about him, so I don't want to get too repetitive, but his vision, his explosiveness, I mean, his he's as good as anybody in the country. He's great as a pass catcher as well. As far as running backs go, you know, there are very few guys across the country that I think you would take over him, if any. Connor Johnson in Toyota Chat wants to know Oregon State prediction. Honestly, man, Oregon State's tough for me because I think they'll be tougher than people assume, but you lose so much top end talent. You know, that the lack of Damian Martinez being out there still, that would have me worrisome if I was an Oregon State fan. That honestly, that's one of the biggest question marks for me on the schedule because I just have a hard time gauging what to expect with Oregon State and Washington State, really, but especially Oregon State. I think they're one of the tougher teams in the country to kind of prognosticate. Kerry Reynolds wants to know, do you think this year's RMS is the biggest game in CSU history? That's a good question. No, I don't think it's the biggest in CSU history. I mean, they've beaten top 10 teams before. Well, you know, whether it's Arizona '94, you beat, you know, a top 10 CU team in 2002. I do think it's probably the biggest CSU game this century. It's certainly the biggest CSU game in Canvas Stadium history. Just the fact that it's on CBS with that national profile. I don't know if you're ever going to have a national stage quite like that again, outside of like being in the college football playoff or something. And I'm not saying CSU is going to the playoff, but if you could do that, that's probably about the only way you could replicate the type of audience that you're going to have with this Rocky Mountain Showdown. ZA Humphrey wants to know who's the backup to BFN. It's going to be Jackson Brousseau. Getting back on the preseason all-conference selections, talked about Gianti. I also had Harrison Whaley of Wyoming. You had to pick 2 running backs. There's a couple guys. Justin Marshall, I don't know if he's going to have the numbers to be in that mix, but, you know, this star CSU freshman back from last year, he's a guy, if you're talking about yards per game, I think was actually number 2 in the league behind Gianti. Much smaller workload, though. And that's why I went with Whaley. I think he's just going to have a much higher volume of touches. That Wyoming team is up there with Oregon State with being kind of hard to predict. They have a lot more continuity on both sides of the ball than Oregon State does. But I mean, losing Craig Bohl is huge. Like, Craig Bohl was the identity of that program, came in and took what was really a disastrous Wyoming program at the time and just completely flipped the identity. And I think not having his steady presence day in and day out it's huge. I mean, it's like losing a Sonny Lubick type coach. It really is that significant. I have so much respect for Craig Bohl. I'm so glad CSU does not have to play against that guy anymore. Now I'm just counting the days till Troy Calhoun retires, but man, I've got respect for those guys. At receiver, Torrey Horton, Ricky White, and Jalen Royals. Ricky White, the UNLV star, led the league in receiving yards a year ago. Jalen Royal put up monster numbers. Jalen Royals, I'm not 100% sure he's even going to be in Logan by the time the season starts, him or Ike Larson, who I voted on the defensive side. But, you know, I submitted these about 2 weeks ago. A lot of receiver talent in the league. I mean, there's a lot of guys you could see if Boise State's passing offense is able to kind of make a leap, maybe they're able to have some representation there. I mean, like if you're counting Washington State, the Mountain West, which I'm not, like a Kyle Williams who went over from UNLV, he's really exciting. Lewis Brown, former CSU receiver who's now at San Diego State. I think he's a guy that could really have a big year as well. San Diego State, kind of another tough team to forecast this year. Tight end for like the third year in a row feels very wide open. It seems like every year in the Mountain West, there's one star tight end that year, and then he moves on. Like we happened with Cole Turner, happened with Trey McBride, happened with Dallin Holker. If you're curious, CSU did not submit Jackson Warren, the transfer tight end, as a selection for preseason all conference recognition. I think that's fair of the staff. I just mean, Dallin was here in the spring. Jackson obviously isn't here till this summer. That's a lot of missed time. 15 practices is a big deal, a couple months in terms of just being in sync with the offense, being within the playbook, all of that. I went with John Michael Gillenborg of Wyoming. He's supposed to have a big year. They claim they're going to throw the football more. Athletically, he's actually pretty nice. He just hasn't had the most opportunities these last couple of years because Wyoming and their offense, they didn't throw it a whole ton. In the trenches at the tackles, I went with Cage Casey of Boise State and Tiger Shanks of UNLV. Epic names. Both those guys coming off of great years. At guard, I went with Mose Vavo of Fresno State. I also went Drew Moss, who is going to be moving in from right tackle to right guard this year, CSU. And Jacob Gardner, CSU center. Wyoming center, I think you also could have put in the mix. There are a couple of guys there. If you're buying into CSU being a good team this year, outside of the talent that they have under center and at the skill positions, I think the biggest reason to believe in this team is that they should be able to run the football with more consistency. They finally got it going late in the year, but I think that had more to do with who was in the backfield than like the offensive line struggling with run blocks or anything like that. But I think the CSUO line very deceptively should be one of the better units in the league. And I mean, it was a year ago as well. Going to give the defense and my specialists here. And just a sec, I do want to shout out Premier Members Credit Union. With Premier Members Credit Union, they're not a bank, which means they do things differently, like putting their members first with higher savings interest and lower loan rates. It's an organization that serves the community and the Colorado community in particular. You'll get local branches, friendly tellers, and the tools you need to save smarter, like their new high-yield savings account, or earn 5% APY on your first $2,000 with their reverse tier money market. When you become a new member at PMCU, you get $200. All you got to do is open a checking account and sign up for e-statements. It's that easy. This will be your best money move yet. Head to becomepremier.com to find out more. I also want to talk to you guys about DNVR events. We've got all kinds of fun stuff going on at DNVR. I've got some takeovers coming up. We've obviously got the Broncos trip this September. Really, really cool. You get access to all kinds of stuff in Tampa Bay Hotel, a boat party, Q&A with Broncos alumni, round trip transportation to the game, a ticket, and more. We're doing a DNVR takeover against the San Francisco Giants for the Rockies on July 20th. We just had yesterday, actually, the Rapids takeover, which is awesome. Keep up with all things DNVR at DNVR_sports, or go to thednvr.com/events and check out the calendar. All right, let's get into the defense and specialists. If you guys got any more questions in the Toyota chat, throw them my way and I'll respond as best as I can. Fun year for the league. A really interesting year. Feels fairly wide open. It's just there's a lot of question marks. You have some continuity with a couple of teams. You also have a lot of question marks just given with the new staffs and everything. It makes it kind of hard to predict. There's a lot of talent at defensive line. I don't know if there's like a Mo Kamara, but Ahmed Hassanin at Boise State's about as close. He's a dude that racked up a ton of sack and tackles for loss production this past year. Keeping with the DL, I've got Newer Gatkuth. I have him breaking out in a major way for CSU. I went back and forth on whether I was going to include him or not, because if you look at his stats compared to a couple other guys, like from Wyoming, for instance, he doesn't quite have it. That said, I think he is going to put up a lot more numbers now that Mo is not there. And I'm really expecting a major ascension from a guy that's highly athletic and really showed a knack for making plays in the backfield a year ago. I do have Jordan Bertignol of Wyoming. They've got a couple of guys that you could choose from. And that could actually hurt them when it comes to preseason all conference recognition. It's going to help their team from a competitive standpoint. But just when it comes to some of the individual recognition and all conference status because they have like 4 guys that are so established. They could all kind of cannibalize each other, and instead of having one guy with the insane numbers, they all just have like kind of okay numbers. We'll see. I've got Son Toa of San Jose State rounding out my 4th defensive lineman. San Jose State's another team that's hard to expect much from this year. I think they'll be competitive, but I just think there's going to be a lack of talent. They didn't get burned from the portal as bad as I thought they would after losing, their head coach, though. I'm at linebacker. I went with Jackson Woodard of UNLV, highly athletic playmaker, had a great season this past year. I also went with Chase Wilson of CSU. Chase Wilson and Jack Howell, actually the 2 leading returning tacklers in the entire conference, both Rams. So if you're looking for reasons to potentially believe on the CSU defense, maybe making a leap, they do have a lot of guys that have made a lot of plays the last couple of years. Rounding out my linebackers, I have Andrew Simpson of Boise State and Shea Suanoa of Wyoming. Wyoming's front 7 is awesome. It's just about determining which of those guys in the front 7 you think are going to stand out the most. I went with Suanua and Burdick Knoll, but I mean, they've got a couple of guys that are going to be pretty solid. And Andrew Simpson, I think, is the heartbeat of that Boise State defense. He's really solid, makes plays all over the field. My favorite group in the league might be the safeties. It was hard to leave a couple of these guys out. I mean, like Tavion Combs from New Mexico, for instance. You're not going to see him getting a lot of hype. He missed most of last year with injury. He's a stud. Before he got hurt, man, he's a guy that moves around. They'll put him in the nickel. They'll put him back deep. He's got great ball skills. A little bit undersized, but he's just a pit bull out there. I went with Jack Howell, who is the returning leading tackler in the Mountain West, trying to become the first 3 consecutive all-conference selection in CSU history. I went with him and Ike Larson. Ike Larson, playmaker, guy that blocks punts. He's a guy that forces fumbles, that creates interceptions. I mean, he does a little bit of all for Utah State. Another guy that I'm not 100% sure he's actually going to be at Utah State by the time the season starts, but assuming they're able to hang on to him, he's a stud. I mean, he's as good as anybody in the league. At corner, I went with Cam Oliver and Cam Lockridge. Cam Oliver of UNLV led the league in interceptions this past year, had a ton of production. And Cam Lockridge led the league in interceptions 2 years ago. He's an example of a guy I wanted to vote for last year, wasn't on the ballot. Just an oversight, I think, from the Fresno admin. He'll get his flowers this time of year, or this time around for this year. I think he and Oliver got a pretty strong argument as the best 2 corners in the league. I'd be surprised if they're not the guys that get picked, but not everybody does it like I do. You vote 4 DBs and you rank them 1 through 4. You could have just gone with the safeties if you thought, these are just the best guy, period. I try to do mine as close to a real lineup as you can. So 2 safeties, 2 corners, a couple of interior defensive linemen, a couple of edge guys. You don't have to do it that way, though. So I just wanted to make sure that it was known. Shout out to Taylor in the Toyota chat. He says, loving the content during the dog days of summer, Justin. Keep it up. I got you, man. We've got all kinds of fun content coming out these next couple of weeks. We're really locking in, especially now that I'm almost done with the chaos of this move. Once I get back from Vegas, I'll be out there tomorrow. I mean, we're hitting the ground running, which I certainly can't wait for. The specialists, I went with Jonah Dalmas at kicker of Boise State and James Ferguson Reynolds, punter of Boise State. Again, like, maybe Boise doesn't have, outside of Gianti, the star power that you're used to from that program, but they're really solid, and they probably got the preseason offensive and defensive player of the year, with also 2 of the better specialists in the league. There's a lot to like about that. Punt returner, I went Torrey Horton. Kick returner, Jacob DeJesus of UNLV. Quietly, really good special teams in this conference. So you've got a lot of experience at kicker. Dalmas is back at Boise State, but John Hoyland, I know he ended the year really poorly, but historically has been awesome. Jordan Noyes was great for CSU last year. He's a guy I talked about on the pod last night as deceptively being one of the big keys for the Rams having success this year. He stepped up in a big way last year. Obviously, was huge in that Boise game. Should have got the game-winning field goal against UNLV. He's huge. They need him to have the type of consistency he had, because college kickers can be a roller coaster. Like, there have been some guys, even statistically, that were pretty decent the last couple years, but they weren't clutch necessarily. Jordan Noyes is clutch, and they need more of that from him. I had to go with Dalmas because he's done it more consistently over, more years, gets more attempts, all that type of stuff. I'm trying to be fair about it. That's the thing. I voted for more CSU players than I would have anticipated coming in, and it was kind of eye-opening just how little continuity there is within the Mountain West from top to bottom. There just aren't that many teams that have as much returning talent as CSU does. And between that and the schedule, like, there's a lot of reasons to buy into this team making a major leap. And if you're going to go the opposite route and say the glass is half empty, there's also plenty of reason based on recent history. Again, this is fair if you feel this way, that says CSU finds a way to shoot themselves in the foot and, Ram life prevails. I inherently choose to live life a little bit more optimistically. Sometimes that bites me in the butt. Sometimes it pays off. But I try and be fair. That's really all I try and do. I try and point out both sides of the coin, allow you guys to ultimately decide the viewpoint that you want. I frame it how I view, but I'm not trying to necessarily tell you it has to be this way either. But I can't wait. I can't wait for media days. I can't wait for the football season. Before we get out of here, Henry in the Toyota chat says, how do you think NIL is going to affect the consistent smaller schools in the Mountain West? With some schools putting more into it than others, how does this affect small markets but good programs? Air Force. That's a great question, man. Air Force in general is probably a unique situation that you can't really compare them to anybody else. They're like the only team in the country that's not going to rely on the transfer portal right now. But I think for schools like Wyoming, like Nevada, it becomes a really interesting dynamic because those are programs that historically have been successful. I mean, Nevada, I know they were terrible the last couple of years, but I think back to the end of the WAC and some of those Kaepernick years, those teams were electric. They had a ton of success in the 90s. Wyoming's been pretty consistent for the majority of the last, 30, 40 years. There've been cold stretches there. At some point, though, it becomes hard to retain talent. The disparity in resources becomes too significant to overcome. And I think Wyoming might be trending in the wrong direction when it comes to that. We've already seen it decimate their basketball program. They're kind of hanging on by a thread right now with football. And, and I'm really not even trying to talk shit because I have a lot of respect for Wyoming, especially under Craig Bull. But to me, if you're reading between the lines, there was a little bit of him getting out and going out on top before things kind of hit the wall or shit hit the fan. It would be the way to say it. I know it's not the most eloquent phrase, but I mean, it's true. Like, it kind of feels like if you're Wyoming, there's this cliff that you're racing towards and you can see it and you're desperately trying to get traction and find your footing, but it feels inevitable. And I don't know that. Like, I've been super honest about, I know that CSU's got to do what's best for them in the future. And, conference realignment, it's all up in the air right now. There's a possibility where some of these schools aren't even in the same league anymore, 5-6 years from now. But I say all this stuff about Wyoming just as somebody who's watching the situation, not as somebody who's necessarily like cheering for their demise, because I love the history between CSU and Wyoming. I think it's one of the most special rivalries in all of sports. It just feels like they have some really tough hurdles to go up against. As Henry says, he just wants Air Force to stop being good. Me too, man. CSU hasn't beat Air Force in the spring since 2002. So maybe this is the year. Maybe things change. And I think Taylor said it well too. They can be good. Let's just be better than them for once. That's how it was under Sonny, man. Like, Sonny owned Wyoming. He still had some struggles with Air Force. Everyone had. I mean, they've had great coaches. Like, that's the thing about Air Force that I think gets often overlooked. It's easy to focus on the wonkiness of their system, obviously the triple option, and it gives teams a lot of looks that they're not used to, and that is a legitimate factor. I'm not trying to downplay that. But one, they don't really run the same option that they used to like 10 years ago. They've modernized a little bit, which is good for them. It's actually made them more competitive. It's the continuity within their staff that makes them so dangerous. You had Fisher DeBerry all those years. Now you've had, Calhoun for close to 2 decades. Like that's such a recipe for success, especially when you're at a wonky spot like Air Force, where you really need somebody to have a firm understanding of how to operate within their really real restraints, which is just like on another level. I mean, the academic restrictions, I think you have to get a letter recommending you from like your state congressman to get into the Air Force. I mean, there's all kinds of crazy things that go into that. But NIL definitely could be a big factor for what kind of separates some of these schools like Boise State, like CSU, San Diego State, UNLV, Fresno, even, from the Wyomings, the Nevadas, and the New Mexicos of the world. We'll see. I can't wait for media days this week. We'll talk about the preseason all-conference team, the official teams when they come out. Hope everybody enjoyed this. I sure do appreciate everybody that was active in the Toyota chat. You guys are great. We'll have written content coming out. We'll have more pods as well. Much love, y'all. Always proud to be. Peace.